Hey internets, first off, this video is another one of those fun videos that is sponsored by me. There are some new Fumo hats now available on the merch store. These hats' eyes are embroidered just like an actual Fumo. Here's a picture of one next to an actual Fumo. And the hats are available in multiple colors and styles. And these are some pretty good quality hats too. It's got this nice metallic mechanism for adjusting the size. It's a lot better than those incremental plastic crap things. So yeah, you can buy these now, customize them however you want, and I'll also be releasing them at a nice introductory sale price for the rest of this month. So yeah, get those while you can, and the profits do definitely directly help out me in terms of making more content for my channel. But anyways, let's get into things. This video shall go over the very ridiculous concept known as cultural appropriation. You may already know what it is and are interested in an in-depth explanation for why it's a nonsensical concept, or perhaps you have no idea what cultural appropriation is and you just clicked on this video for whatever reason just because you're curious. Either way, you are in for a wild ride, because the funny thing about cultural appropriation is that it's one of those really bad ideas that is such a bad idea that when you examine it more and more under the microscope and really dissect the ideology of where it's coming from, it just gets more and more ridiculous. Which is actually kind of fascinating. Most bad ideas out there, no matter how bad they are, at the very least, when you seriously critically examine them, it reveals to have at least some kind of nugget of truth to them that explains why some people might get duped into believing this nonsense. But nope, not cultural appropriation. The deeper into this rabbit hole you go and the more you understand it, the more unfathomably stupid this concept reveals itself to be. So then, what is cultural appropriation? Well, since this is a MA video, let's use some Fumos to explain it. Let's say you've got a village of ice fairies, and part of their culture is to fly around. Ice fairies like to fly around a lot. They do it for fun, they do it whatever. It's just a thing that they do. And they just enjoy flying around together, just having a good time. But then one day, they see Marissa the witch flying over their village. Wow, what a travesty. Such disrespect. And so one of the ice fairies flies up and tells Marissa, hey, you can't do that. Flying is our thing. We're the ones that fly. Flying is our culture. You can't fly. That belongs to us. By flying around, you're disrespecting us. Now, for a brief moment here, Marissa ponders firing off a Grandmaster Spark, but in this instance, let's just say she decides to just fly away anyway and not care, while the ice fairies continue to seethe. Yep, that is pretty much what cultural appropriation is. In a nutshell, cultural appropriation is when someone from one culture adopts the elements of another culture, allegedly without giving credit or showing proper respect. Which, interestingly enough, is where the first problem of the concept of cultural appropriation comes into play, which is that the people who get offended by cultural appropriation and claim that it's a bad thing tend to get offended by it regardless of whether or not proper respect is actually shown. Rather, in the real world, we see a different pattern entirely. So let's go over some actual examples of some butthurt generated by cultural appropriation and see if you can spot the pattern. Here's one that happened all the way back in 2017. A couple of white girls decided to open up a burrito shop in Portland, thus committing the grave sin of cultural appropriation because, you know, they were white girls, not Mexicans. And so they ended up closing up shop after only a week, after being shamed for stealing culture that doesn't belong to them. Just look at some of these comments. They are clearly exploiting centuries of tradition and survival, or that these white girls only stole the culture so that other white people don't have to be inconvenienced of dealing with the pesky brown middlewoman getting in their way. Wow, some pretty heated accusations there. Let's move on to another example. How about white women committing the horrible crime of wearing a kimono despite not being Japanese? Yeah, so apparently there was a thing at the Boston Museum of Fine Art back in 2015 where they decided to have a little kimono Wednesday thing going on. That of course involved people wearing kimonos regardless of their ethnicity. And then the event was eventually canceled after a group of protesters accused the event of being racist and of cultural appropriation. So sad. But anyways, how about a more recent example? Here we have a relatively new VTuber by the name Banana Juju. Aside from the usual VTuber shenanigans and jiggles, nothing really seems offensive here, and oh no, it's a white girl model with dreadlocks. Yep, apparently that's cultural appropriation. Dreadlocks are apparently only to be worn by black people, and so having them while white is disrespectful. Cue the massive Twitter mob of random anger and random butthurt. Although in this particular example, the target of the hate mob decided that, you know what, haters gonna hate, and so she's still doing what she's doing. She didn't close up shop, she didn't quit or anything. She's still there and deal with it. Now, of course, you may have noticed the pattern. All of the people being targeted by these shaming campaigns are, strangely enough, white girls. Although in some cases, if you dig deep enough, you'll also also find examples of it happening to white men, but those cases don't really tend to gain as much traction because, quite frankly, we don't care. TLDR, the accusation of cultural appropriation tends to only really be thrown at white people. In fact, funny enough, one of the accounts that was complaining about cultural appropriation towards Banana Juju was apparently a black woman who is very blatantly appropriating Japanese culture. And so there's a very silly, very thinly veiled element of hypocrisy built into the type of people who get offended by cultural appropriation. The concept isn't actually uniformly applied. Rather, it seems to be just another anti-white woke scold tactic. And it seems that way because when you examine it further, well, that's pretty much exactly what it is. The same people who whine about cultural appropriation tend to also be the people who claim that racism equals prejudice plus power, and therefore only white people can be racist, and therefore it's only cultural appropriation when a white person does it. Yeah, it's pretty dumb. And now I could potentially end this video by simply explaining once again why redefining racism to mean prejudice plus power doesn't actually make sense, and why saying only white people can be racist is a really dumb thing to say, which of course would just be calling out the usual midwittery of trying to avoid philosophical problems by redefining words and arguing semantics, and why that generally doesn't really work. For instance, in the specific case of redefining racism to have an arbitrary exclusion clause when it comes to white people, it doesn't really work because even if you were to accept that redefinition of racism, it would still include the philosophical problem of believing in collective guilt. Redefining it as P plus P doesn't get rid of the collective guilt problem. And so when you're imputing collective guilt upon a white person, you are therefore still committing a compositional or ecological fallacy depending on the context. That's pretty much why racism equals prejudice plus power is a very dumb argument. It doesn't actually get rid of any of the contradictions in what the woke scolds are saying. And again, I could end this cultural appropriation video at that. But no, like I said at the beginning of this video, the more you examine this and the deeper into the rabbit hole you go, the dumber cultural appropriation reveals itself to be. Yep, that's right, it gets even dumber. Let's seriously think about what cultural appropriation actually is. Just kind of ignoring the whole ethno-hypocrisy element of it where it's only really used to shame white people. Well, let's just ask a simple question. Who's really losing money, or in other words, whose property rights are being violated by a white VTuber wearing dreads, or a white girl wearing a kimono, or a white girl making a burrito? And the answer is absolutely nobody. You see, not only is cultural appropriation just thinly veiled ethno-collective guilt, but what we're really dealing with here, when you really get into it, it's really just an ethno-collectivist patent or intellectual property rights claim on these vague cultural ideas or behaviors, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Because who owns this patent? Who owns this intellectual property? I mean, who's even making the intellectual property or patent infringement claim here? One random Japanese person? Okay, but if it's collectivist, then that means if another random Japanese person doesn't care and isn't offended by non-Japanese people wearing kimono, then that would therefore completely invalidate the claim because it's a collectivist claim. This is the problem with collectivist claims. And by the way, spoiler alert, most Japanese people don't care. Ironically, it's usually only the ones who grew up in the West and who get indoctrinated by woke ideology that ever find it offensive. Most of the Japanese people from Japan, when you talk to them on the streets about cultural appropriation, they don't find it offensive at all. In fact, they don't even understand why it would even be offensive, because of course they're not indoctrinated into woke ideology. The point is, it'd be very hard to make an IP claim from a collectivist standpoint, as collectives don't really exist, they're just a social construct, and so individuals within the collective could just argue amongst each other. They could just have contentions and counterclaims. It'd be a very hard thing to do in court. But let's pretend that that's not a problem for a moment. Then you still just run into the general problem of claiming to own an idea. Ideas are not scarce resources, and copying is not the same thing as theft, as a copy is not inducing any kind of conflict over any kind of scarce resource. So for example, one person's ability to paint a picture of a Fumo does not in any way impede his neighbor's ability to paint a picture of a Fumo. No conflict of resources is involved in this kind of duplication. And of course, in some cases, people can have the same idea just from pure coincidence. This is the general contention that happens with the whole debate of whether or not IP should even exist. And here's the funny thing, the only argument that people in favor of IP that is even remotely reasonable, which is the argument that intellectual property gives people a greater incentive to invest in large intellectual projects such as AAA game development or something like that, well, that one argument doesn't even apply here. Because the thing is, even the people who are in favor of intellectual property understand that after a certain amount of time, it actually stifles innovation and stifles stifles incentives. And that's why pretty much every economist is at least in favor of having some kind of time limit on intellectual property. And most people agree that the current time limits we have, which max out at around 75 years or so, are already way too high. And here's the funny thing, within the case of cultural appropriation, we're talking about things that have existed for over 1,000 years. The burrito, the kimono, and dreadlocks have all existed for over 1,000 years. So like I said earlier, this just keeps on getting more and more ridiculous. So even if we ignore all of the other problems with trying to claim that cultural appropriation is bad, ignore the fact that it's just ethnic collective guilt, ignore the fact that it's applied in a manner that is completely hypocritical and completely inconsistent, ignore the problems with claiming collective ownership over a freaking idea, ignore the fact that it's causing a conflict over a non-scarce resource. Just ignore all that. Even then, just the length of time that these cultural ideas that people are claiming are being appropriated, a lawyer specializing in intellectual property rights would just tell you that the time limit has long expired. And then lastly, there's just the economic claim. Often people whining about cultural appropriation will make the claim that, hey, by making this thing that another culture made, you're taking money away from that minority group. That was one of the arguments again for why Cook's Burritos was bad, because now it was a white woman selling it, taking away money from a genuine Mexican person. But that's not true either. It has been proven time and time again that competition helps the market. And in this particular case, in the case of cultural appropriation, the interesting thing is that when people buy a product or service and they like the product or service, they generally seek out a more genuine version of that product or service to buy it again. So when a person say they like kimonos, they often will go out and seek a more genuine version of a kimono, which means they'll try and seek out a genuinely Japanese made one in Japan. Or on the other case, if a person likes dreadlocks, they might seek out a hairdresser that specializes in doing them, which, you know, has a pretty good chance of being an African-American hairdresser. And then of course, when people decide that they like a certain food, they will often seek out better and more authentic versions of that food. So they will go to other Mexican restaurants as well to check them out, which means that ultimately a member of that minority or group that the culture supposedly came from will end up profiting as well anyways. So this final claim is just another weird example of the fixed pie fallacy, and not understanding that economics doesn't always have to be a zero-sum game. It's this typical socialist error of not understanding that a smaller piece of a bigger pie is actually often better than a bigger piece of a smaller pie, because they don't understand that you can grow the pie. And in the case of cultural appropriation, it's not understanding that when you allow other people to partake in certain elements of a culture, from an economic standpoint, what you're really doing is you're growing the customer base. More people get interested in the culture, more people like the culture, thus more people are looking for things to buy from that specific cultural element that they're enjoying, which thus grows the pie, which means more money in the pockets of the origin of that culture. And thus the minorities from which the culture originates from will generally see a monetary gain from it rather than a monetary loss. And so thus cultural appropriation is just kind of left with one final claim, which is that it's offensive because it just is. I just feel offended and therefore it's offensive. That's really all they're left with. And the funny thing is, this is honestly, when we examine everything, probably just an example of a grievance grift. These people probably aren't really offended. They're just pretending to be offended because they don't like the people partaking in cultural appropriation. Since there's no conflict over scarce resources, and cultural appropriation actually provides an economic boon to minorities, there's no real harm being committed by cultural appropriation, so the only reason to claim to be offended by it is really just in-group bias being projected as out-group dislike. And so they're pretending to be offended and pretending to be harmed as a way to mask that out-group disdain. And so ultimately, people whining about cultural appropriation is just more proof that anti-racism, when unmasked, is just anti-white racism. It's another example of the foolishness of thinking that you can fix problems caused by ethno-collective guilt with more ethno-collective guilt. Cultural appropriation is therefore a completely ridiculous, self-contradictory concept that honestly is really, really hard to take seriously. And so that's all I have to say on the subject. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to support my content, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or again by buying some merch, and there is that new Fumo merch on an introductory sale. So be sure to get those while the sale lasts. Thanks again for watching. That is all. Till next time.